Now that I've called our leader back, we can we may restart the meeting.
Under
Next item, Mike.
operations, none submitted. Finance budget report.
Hey, we have something to report tonight. Good job. Okay.
I had my media moment already, so I'm past. So, good evening, President Logan, Superintendent Thompson, Vice President Rhodey, members of the board. So yes, we have a little bit to talk about tonight, so I'm going to jump right in. Before we get into the legislative action that occurred last week, we're going to talk a little bit about state revenues. After a little bit of lackluster, okay, there's a lot of distractions back here. A little bit of lackluster performance and as far as revenues at the state level in December and January. February and March tax receipts actually came in better than estimates for a combined total of over $65.4 million. Collections through the end of the third quarter are 5% above forecast and $140 million more than the same time last year. Why is this important to us? 73% of our budget flows to us through the state. So if the state is having some budget challenges, we're at risk for not receiving perhaps all the revenues that we would anticipate. So certainly keeping a close eye on how the state is performing on its budget is a critical component to ours, and certainly the better they do, the less risk that we have of a mid-year cut or some sort of allotment process. So we're very pleased that the state is performing well at this point, sets us up well for a fourth quarter where we shouldn't have any issues from a state budget perspective. So, talking a little bit about all the activity that occurred here last week. So the good news of the evening is that Senate Bill 16 did pass and was signed by the governor. So we would like to take, I think, an opportunity to express some appreciation to our legislators. As this board well knows, when your resources are X and your needs are Y, it is a challenging process to come to a consensus, and we have at least common interests. Up there, interests tend to vary. So coming to a consensus in time to meet some of the Supreme Court deadlines, I think it is a moment for us to say thank you for those efforts, and that we'll see what those next steps bring. And certainly also that a lot of the non-financial items that might have put this bill at a little bit more risk were stripped out from earlier versions, so that for the most part we have a financial bill with a few items that are not financial in nature but are more informational as far as some audits, and we'll go through those as far as some of the non-financial provisions in this bill. But for the most part, it's a fairly clean bill. So it does provide $90 million of new funding statewide in fiscal year 20 to account for inflation in response to Gannon 6. And what this looks like on the base per pupil, in the first column, you see what the current law base per pupil is set at. And that current law includes the $522 million that was put into school finance last year. And so those were the scheduled increases per pupil. Senate Bill 16, you can see the impact of the $90 million on the statewide base aid per pupil, so that we have, instead of a $137 per pupil increase, we're looking at a $271 per pupil increase. And then in the outlying years, we do return to about the $133 to $137 range per pupil. So some of those other key provisions that we talked about, there are several new accountability reports that will be required from all districts. They will be district-wide reports. They will be per building reports. Those haven't been fleshed out yet. KSDE's been challenged to work on versions of those that we'll start to probably see this fall, but we'll have to publish those on our website, as well as what they're calling longitudinal reports, which is basically student achievement reports for the same student year over year, so that as a kindergartner moves to first grade, moves to second grade, that they'll have a running history of what those assessment scores look like, so that you can hopefully see progress in each district. And then within those accountability reports, there's also required to be a link to KSDE so that anyone that's out looking at our data can go to KSDE and then compare our performance to the statewide performance of other districts. So those are requirements that are embedded in this bill. There's a few others that include reporting expenditures for school finance litigation since 2010, which we've been fairly religious about releasing upon request. So all of that data is ready to go. There are some changes in the bilingual audit schedule. We are on schedule for an at-risk audit for this fall. The bilingual audit was scheduled for 2022. That will be moved back to 2021. So we're having that a year earlier. There was a lot of conversation concerning bilingual and how long students should be eligible for waiting. So I think this is kind of what it boiled down to for this bill, was an accelerated audit schedule to give the legislature some data surrounding bilingual students, how much money is going in, and the programs related to serving those populations. There will also be an unencumbered cash balance audit, whereby they will look at school districts' unencumbered cash balances across the state. They'll probably set up a metric as far as what's an acceptable amount. 15% is kind of the overarching guideline right now as far as 15% of operating expenditures. So again, we haven't seen a lot of detail yet here. We'll look forward to seeing this fleshed out a little bit more and what that means for us. So we'll have to come back to you with a little bit more information as we get further details released to us. In addition to the ACT exam for juniors, there's now a pre-ACT test that will be administered to 9th graders. There are some FTE reports related to virtual programming that will be required, and then some evidence-based programming, including Jobs for America's Graduates. That's the JAG program. Boys and Girls Clubs, Communities and Schools is another. They all were listed as evidence-based programs and therefore can be paid for using at-risk funds. So it was just kind of blessing these items as far as at-risk can be used for these types of programs. So there were a few others that weren't as critical to our daily business, but those are kind of the big highlights as far as things that we will have to address in the coming years.
So is this a can be or a required to be?
Can be. There's not required to be. It will be our choice. So a few of those items that got stripped out of the bill, again, we mentioned the focus on bilingual weighting. There had been some discussion that we would have a limit on the number of years a student might qualify for bilingual weighting. That was stripped out of the bill, so it's not there. There was a provision requiring school districts to identify local sources of revenue. In our case, over 90% of our local revenue are tax dollars, but the remaining 9 to 10% are a whole variety of little pieces, which would have been a little bit cumbersome to have to report on, so I'm kind of glad personally that got stripped out of the bill. A provision requiring superintendents to certify that district budgets were reasonably calculated to ensure each student could meet the ROSE capacities, but it was that kind of generic statement without a lot of meat underneath as far as what that meant, so that was stripped out fairly early. There were provisions around bullying that didn't make the final bill, although there will be some work related to bullying occurring in various committees as we go through the year. The one of concern to me was the elimination of special ed state aid, that 92% that the state is striving to meet. There was some language early on that was going to be stripped out of the final bill, but that didn't make it either. So right now we're still that's the goal, is the state is supposed to be reimbursing at a 92% of excess cost. As a reminder, we're sitting in the 81, 82, 83% range, so we're not to 92, but that's a much better reimbursement rate than we've had when we were down in the 70s. So we've made progress. There were some changes in transportation funding also early on, and to the bond cap. None of those made the final bill. And then some requirements looking at graduation courses, that got dropped early. and then counting out-of-state students. So none of these items made the final bill, which again is good, because that's less that the court will need to look at as far as determining what it does next. So just as a reminder of the legislative and court timelines, April 15th, the briefs are due to the Kansas Supreme Court. 10 days later, response briefs are due. May 9th is the oral argument date. And certainly with a fairly limited number of items to consider, we would hope to have a decision before June 30th. The court will look to see if the inflation added is reasonably calculated. That's been kind of their measuring or yardstick. Is that reasonably calculated language related to any methodology they've put forth, whether it was inflation or additional monies in general. However, given the $90 million of inflow for this coming fiscal year, it is likely that we are set for fiscal year 20. So if they would find that it isn't reasonably calculated for some reason, but there's $90 million this year, chances of us basically saying it's good for this year, but perhaps we need to look at it again. I think it's likely we'll be fine for fiscal year 20. Which is good, because that does mean we can kind of start to really dig into some of those budgetary details as we move forward. We want to take a minute, though, to talk about this focus on accountability that's coming out of the legislature within this bill. Tremendous focus on accountability. The legislators want to see a return on the investment they're making in education. They are looking to hold districts responsible to allocate resources provided to improve student achievement, which certainly will necessitate continued conversations that we all have with our legislators, community members, parents, staff, and students. That outcomes are certainly a team effort. No one variable. I mean, we don't educate students in a test tube where we can just put in one small change and we can evaluate if that one change was the thing that made the difference. We're an accumulation of different factors. Everybody plays a part in that. So that focus on accountability has to be a community discussion. And certainly I think what dovetails nicely into the budget discussion on accountability is what you heard earlier this evening, which is kind of the exciting part of work already being done by the district, is that we are already focusing on accountability. We might not be focusing on the same measures that the legislature wants, but certainly the work that we're doing should bring about some of those improvements in assessments and other outcomes that the legislatures were looking for. So I included 2 of their slides in my presentation because I thought it was so critical to tie that work that the district and the board has been doing related to its strategic plan into these accountability focuses that are coming down to us from the legislature. So I think we certainly can hold up our head and say, bring it on, because we've already made it a good step down that path. So kind of what's next for us? Certainly we're going to continue to work on our estimated fixed cost increases and our estimates related to what we believe our weightings will look like. So what do we think is going to happen with our at-risk weighting, bilingual weighting? Those are the changeable items as we go into fiscal year 20 that we'll need to have some good conversations with staff to make sure we've got pretty solid numbers going into our fiscal year 20 planning process. Certainly the Board of Education's review tonight of the strategic plan, the work done so far in order to set budget priorities. You've seen the impact of the past 2 years and the focus on the areas that's where we put our funds, and we had lift. So that continued work to really refine our budgeting process and focus those dollars on areas that we believe are going to get us to our goals will be important. And that work of budgeting wraps around that strategic plan instead of budgeting driving the conversations, which has been a nice change for us, and hopefully we will continue that over the next few years. So not a lot of details yet because we're still in the data collection process. Now that we have a pretty good idea that our funding is stable for fiscal year 20, hopefully we'll be able to bring you back a little bit more fleshed out detail in May. But certainly to recap for tonight, A school finance bill, Senate Bill 16, was passed by the legislature and approved by the governor. Fiscal year 20 budget planning will move forward under the Senate Bill 16 finance plan. We will certainly be carefully monitoring what happens next at the Supreme Court. In the Gannon 7 will be that decision. And in the meantime, we will continue to collect and refine our fixed cost estimates and collect budget increases with the intent of vetting those increases through the lens of the strategic plan, which will be important as we, again, focus on accountability and outcomes. Any questions tonight related to what's happened legislatively?
Mike?
And I do want to apologize. I've read this several times and I didn't apparently read it. On the one that says other key provisions, the first link, and I don't know, Dr. Thompson, if this comes to you or to Susan, but it says several new accountability reports for each school district and each school building and an annual longitudinal report on student achievement. That tells me that we've got to have 100 reports because we've got to have one for every building, and then we've got to have a district-wide one. So that's basically 100 reports. Are we going to have to hire somebody administratively to do these reports?
I think they're all looking at me. Just kidding. Well, not only that, we also have to have that for each individual student available to their parent as well. So you can add on to 50,000 of them. So the answer would probably be that we would need to look at our existing structures, which do not include that. And if we are required to do that, then we will need to look at how we increase something to be able to get that done. Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I
Kim,
apologize. I've looked at this several times and read it, and I understood it, but I didn't realize that, to me, that's telling me we might need 2 or 3 people to put in administration, and then they complain that we have too many administrators.
Well, that's the devil's in the details. As we continue to learn more about their expectations, what they'll be asking, we'll try to engage in we will not try. We will engage in those conversations and ask to be a part of them, as we know this will be another task that will need to be completed on our parts, which will require more staff.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the report, Susan.
Yes.
Ben?
Yes, Dr. Thompson, just an idea that I had. So over the past decade, for the Wichita Public Schools, many cuts have had to happen because of the decrease in state funding. And it doesn't have to be right now, but could maybe we receive some sort of an idea of all the things that we've had to cut over the past, decade and a half. So as this new funding increases and as our strategic plan gets implemented, we can maybe hand pick some of the things that our community really misses about our school district.
We can go back as far as we can think, but I can tell you we're in the ballpark of close to being around $100 million, close to that.
so it's been a combination of not only cuts, but shifts. So certainly capital outlay is a good example of where costs have shifted over the years. When we were able to move technology purchases out of the supplemental general fund, when capital rules changed, we shifted funds out of the 08 fund to 16, which again freed up some funding to pay for different sorts of expenditures in order to free up different funding to pay for more teachers and classroom needs. So we've had to move dollars around. So it's looking at a combination of cuts and shifts. We've had to do that for close to $100 million.
That on the slide that you actually have on the screen, that first bullet where it talks about the reports and student achievement, I just want to make sure that I heard you correctly. On student achievement, they're talking about student achievement following the child, like how they did on 3rd grade assessment, how they did on 4th grade, how they did on 5th grade, as opposed to following all 3rd graders every year.
Right, it's to look at it over the course, my understanding, and I may not have all the details quite right, but my understanding is it's looking at that kind of lifespan of the student. Where are they here? Where are they the next year? Where are they the next year? Where are they the next year? So that kind of long look as opposed to just taking a cross-section, which they have today. They have that data as far as how do all third graders perform on an assessment. What they don't necessarily have is how that one student did year over year over year over year.
And-
Absolutely.
And what we have from verbiage from the bill, longitudinal data on students, how they performed on state assessments in ELA, math, and science.
Okay. And they do realize that their tests haven't been the same. Okay. Yeah, because that
And their Kansas Can Vision would say that assessments aren't the only item to evaluate, but yet these accountability reports are looking at assessments. So
okay.
there's some
Because
challenges
that
there.
truly is data that we may be looking at it at building level, but we haven't looked at that at the state level nor at the district level before.
And we also, Ms. Logan, take a deeper dive. We don't just look at whether our kids in third grade have comprehension skills. We actually look at all of the skills, the 5 areas we will be looking at.
Right.
So we'll even have more in-depth information about our children than just the state assessments that they are requiring the longitudinal study, the longitudinal data on.
If they're asking us on the financial side, on the accountability, the financial numbers are relatively easy to provide. Speaking to Mr. Rohde's question earlier, what becomes much more difficult is tying that financial data to a particular outcome based on a particular set of criteria. Because again, there's so many factors that could go into influence that particular outcome, whether it was this program, this program, this program, this teacher, this building principal, this culture. That's where we will have a challenge. Financial data we can provide all day, and we do, all day. Whenever anyone asks for it, we can spit out financial data without any issue, and we'll have to do it even more in depth with the ESSA requirements that are coming down where we have to report at the building level. So we're already working on that type of information anyway, but when we then have to really tie to outcomes, this was a goal for us as far as a strategic financial plan and how do we evaluate these programs to give you that information for a few years out. We're going to have to accelerate some of our timeline related to one of my department's goals. We're going to have to move a little faster.
Okay, thank you. I'm excited that at least for 1 year, we're stable, and then we'll have to see what the courts say about the future years,
That's the
correct?
hope, yes.
Okay, Stan?
I also appreciate the work of the legislature to get this done. This is a better timing than we've ever had in the past, so that's good news. I think all of us, all 7 of us, look forward to meeting somewhere in the middle on accountability. I think each of us showed tonight that we're extremely interested in getting the most out of our dollars, just like the legislature wants that. So I think the only question there is where we're going to meet. And so I look forward to that discussion as well. I am going to steal a page from what Julie has mentioned in the past before, though. Again, with the state-based aid, we are talking about with the signature, hopefully tomorrow, I'm assuming we will, it's going to be 4436 in 1920. But again, if you look historically, before the recession of 2018 and before the Brownback cuts that started in 2010, how do those state aid numbers match?
So at kind of its peak, it was sitting around $4,400. So we will just get back barely over that for next fiscal year with the $90 million inflation factor. And then after that, we'll definitely improve. That's going to be the big question the court's going to look at is, given that was the argument on inflation back from the Montoy Safe Harbor, is what they've put in enough to compensate?
So we are already giving a bit on inflation to a certain extent because we are just now getting up to pre-Great Recession of 28. I realize we've got a dip there where you would take some inflation off as well. But again, we're just now getting back to '08, is that correct?
As far as the level where we were in
Right.
08, 09 to where we're going to be in 1920, yes, we're going to be improved about $36 per pupil.
And so if you think back in your own personal budget, even with the Great Recession of '08, my heating bill is more than it was in '08. It's, and you can look at other expenses, and if you look at our expenses, nobody wants to pay for the basics, but someone has to. And so, again, this is a great victory. We appreciate the governor's leadership. We appreciate the legislature coming together on this, but there's still some more work to be done. And the work that needs to be done is in the area of accountability and in the area of, we gotta somehow get this triangle of the legislature, local school boards, and the Kansas Department of Education. We talk a good game about redesigning schools, creating a future that is not designed specifically tagged to a test score, but yet when we go into accountability, that's exactly where we all go to, is a certain test score on a standardized test. Somewhere along the line, we have to have a meeting of a mind in that triangle of that it is more, accountability is more than just test scores.
I see no other comments, so thank you so very much. We'll
you.
look forward to your next report when we start to really see a budget. Thank you.
We'll actually get a budget.